Somewhere in a museum storage room, tucked away among thousands of forgotten artifacts, lies a small piece of baked clay, small enough to fit in the palms of your hands. At first glance, it seems ordinary, yet impressed into its surface is the story of a war. On its own, that isn't unusual. Museums are filled with records of ancient conflicts. Empires loved documenting their conquests. Kings carved their victories into mountainsides, painted them across temple walls, and ordered scribes to press their triumphs into thousands of clay tablets. In many ways, war records are humanity's oldest form of bragging. But this tablet is different. According to the dates researchers have painstakingly reconstructed, the war it describes took place before writing was supposed to exist, before cities had risen, and before what we normally call civilization had even begun. That raises an extraordinary question. How can a written record describe a war from a time before writing itself? If the dates are correct, this tiny clay tablet may preserve the memory of a forgotten world, one that challenges everything we thought we knew about the earliest chapters of human history. And then, on the other side of the world, a completely separate culture tells what looks remarkably like the same story. That's the mystery sitting at the center of everything we're going to explore today. And it matters in a way that goes far beyond one dusty artifact in one museum collection. Because if two unconnected civilizations preserved a memory of the same conflict across thousands of years, across thousands of miles, without any obvious way of sharing that memory, then we have to ask a question that makes historians genuinely uncomfortable. How deep does human memory actually go? Before we get there, though, let's set this exactly the kind of subject where it's easy to get carried away. Someone finds an old text describing a battle. Someone else finds a different old text describing what sounds like a battle. And suddenly people are talking about ancient global civilizations and lost continents, and knowledge being beamed from one culture to another across impossible distances. That's not what we're doing here. The honest version of this story is actually stranger and more interesting than any of those shortcuts. So, what would actually count as evidence? What would make two separate traditions describing a similar war something more than coincidence? A few things. The specific details would need to match in ways that myths will normally converge on by accident. Myths from different cultures do share patterns. That's real. It's called mythic patterning, and scholars have studied it for over a century. Hero defeats monster. World is flooded. Gods fight gods. These templates appear everywhere because they seem to emerge from something deep in how humans make sense of existence. So if all we had were two stories where armies fought and someone won, that would mean almost nothing. But if the details line up, the geography, the factions, specific events in a specific sequence that starts to demand a different kind of explanation, then you'd need to rule out later borrowing. Cultures have always traded stories. Merchants carry myths the way they carry goods. Conquerors import their narratives into the places they take over. So even if two traditions share detailed memories, the possibility that one borrowed from the other has to be taken seriously. Dating becomes everything. If one tradition is demonstrably older than any known contact between the cultures, the borrowing hypothesis gets harder to sustain. And finally, you'd want to see what the archaeology actually says about whether the events described could have happened, not whether they happened exactly as described. Myths are never documentaries, but whether the physical record of the period shows signs of the kind of disruption the stories seem to remember. That's the framework we're going to work through. Not to prove an extraordinary claim, but to follow the evidence carefully and see where it actually leads, including into the places where scholars genuinely disagree and nobody has a clean answer yet. So, what is the tablet? We'll go much deeper into the physical object itself in the next section. But here's the broad picture you need to carry with you going forward. It's a uniform tablet, meaning it was written by pressing a reed stylus into wet clay in the stone. Writing system developed in ancient Mesopotamia, the region that is modern Iraq. The text on it describes a conflict, a clash between organized groups with specific territories, specific leaders, and a specific outcome. When researchers began working out when the events described in the text actually took place, not when the tablet was written, but when the events it records supposedly happened, the dates they arrived at pushed back uncomfortably far into a period when, by every conventional definition, the kind of organized political conflict the tablet describes shouldn't have been possible yet. There were no states. There was no centralized power. There was no writing to record agreements or issue orders, and yet here is something that reads less like mythology and more like a chronicle. Then there's the second tradition. Not a tablet, not uniform, a completely different culture, a completely different writing system, a completely different part of the world, preserving in its oldest texts and oral traditions what looks, once you lay it next to the tablet, startlingly familiar. The same rough geography of conflict, the same type of coalition on one side, a similar collapse on the other. We're going to spend serious time on both of these, on what they say word for word, on how scholars have interpreted them, on where the interpretations diverge and where they converge. But the first thing you need to feel right now is the sheer strangeness of the question. Two civilizations, one memory, no obvious connection. How the journey we're going on is going to take us through how we actually date ancient texts, and in the events they describe, which is a genuinely fascinating process that most people have never thought about. It's going to take us through the content of both traditions line by line, and through what the ground beneath ancient sites physically confirms or challenges. We're going to look at the arguments scholars have actually made, not the pop history versions. The real debates happening in journals and conference rooms where serious people disagree about serious things for serious reasons. And we're going to end up somewhere honest, which means not with a clean answer wrapped in a bow, but with a clear picture of what we can say with confidence, what remains genuinely uncertain, and why that uncertainty is itself interesting. One thing before we dive in: if you're listening to this right now, wherever you are, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I check every one of them, and it's one of my favorite things about making these. Seeing someone in Tokyo at 7 o'clock in the morning next to someone in Buenos Aires falling asleep at 2 a.m., all of us in different places, somehow in the same conversation about the same ancient mystery. That's something I find genuinely moving every time I see it. And if you want to listen to these without any interruptions, no ads, no music, just the story, you can follow the podcast on Spotify. The link is in the description. It's one of the best ways to support what I do here, and it costs you nothing extra if you already have Spotify. Alright, let's go back. Not 900,000 years this time. Not quite that far, but far enough that the world would look almost unrecognizable to us. Far enough that the people who lived through whatever this tablet is describing had no alphabet, no coinage, no iron. Far enough that the very idea of recording events for posterity was still thousands of years from being invented. And yet somehow the record survived, pressed into clay, carried in stories, passed from mouth to ear across uncountable generations until two separate civilizations arrived at something that looks remarkably like the same memory. The question is why, and more uncomfortably, whether it's even possible. Let's find out. Before we can talk about a war that happened before history, we need to agree on what history actually means, because the word gets used loosely, and in this case, the looseness matters enormously. Most people use history to mean the past in general, everything that happened before now. But historians use it much more precisely. Written history means the period for which we have written records, documents, inscriptions, tablets, anything that lets people in the past speak to us directly in their own words. And that period is actually remarkably short. Depending on the region you're looking at, written history starts somewhere between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago. In some parts of the world, it starts even later than that. Before writing, everything is prehistory. The physical record only. Bones and tools and ash layers and pollen samples. No voices, no names, no one telling us what they thought was happening or why. But there's a middle zone that most people don't know about. And it's the zone where this story lives. Proto-history. That's the period when some societies have developed writing and are producing records. But the events those records describe happened earlier in a world that was itself pre-iterate. The text exists, but the events it records don't sit neatly inside the written world. The Iliad is a famous example. It was written down in a form we can read during a period when Greek literacy was well established. But the events it claims to describe, the war at Troy, if it happened at all, happened centuries before the text was composed. The text is historical. The events are proto-historical at best. That gap between composition and claimed event is where things get genuinely complicated and genuinely interesting. It gets more complicated still because writing didn't appear everywhere at once. It emerged unevenly in specific places for specific reasons, usually connected to the needs of centralized administration. Somebody needed to track grain, calculate debts, record ownership. Writing was an accounting tool before it was a literary one. It appeared first in Mesopotamia, then in Egypt, then in the Indus Valley, then in China. Each emergence largely independent, each tethered to a particular kind of social organization that needed records to function. Societies that didn't develop that kind of administrative complexity simply didn't to develop writing. Which means that for thousands of years, sophisticated, complex, organized human communities were doing things that left no written trace at all. They made decisions, they formed alliances, they fought, they remembered. None of it got pressed into clay or carved into stone. And when we finally do get written records from those regions, we're often reading accounts of a past that the writers themselves couldn't verify directly, only inherit. This is where cultural memory enters the picture, and it deserves more respect than it usually gets. Oral tradition is not just storytelling, it's a technology. Proliterate cultures developed extraordinarily sophisticated systems for encoding, transmitting information across generations through ritual retellings, through structured verse forms that made memorization easier, through ceremonial context that gave the memory social weight and community validation. Aboriginal Australians have been shown to carry accurate geographical information in their oral traditions, stretching back thousands of years, describing coastlines that were flooded by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. The memory survived because it was encoded in song, embedded in ceremony, tied to identity in ways that made forgetting dangerous. When writing eventually arrived in societies that had been carrying these traditions, scribes often did exactly what you'd expect. They wrote them down. They codified in permanent form what had previously lived in human minds and human voices. Sometimes the recording happened close to the events. Often, it happened very far from them. The question of how much survived intact across that transmission and how much got reshaped by the assumptions and politics of whoever finally picked up the stylus is one of the central arguments in ancient history scholarship. Now about the word war. We need to be careful here too, because war, in the context of early human societies, doesn't look like what the word conjures for most people. It doesn't look like what standing armies with supply lines and generals issuing orders from command tents. In the earliest periods, we're talking about war, would have looked more like organized raiding. One community crossing into another's territory to take resources, livestock, stored food. Sometimes people, small-scale, violent, consequential for the people involved, but not involving the kind of mass mobilization we associate with later conflicts. As societies became more organized, as settlements grew, and territories became more clearly defined, conflict began to scale up. You start seeing something that looks more like pitched battle between neighboring polities, communities fighting over land, water access, trade routes. Then, as regional power centers emerged, you start seeing coalition warfare, groups forming alliances against a common threat, one dominant city or leader pulling together multiple smaller communities under a shared strategic goal. This is still not ancient Rome, or even Bronze Age Greece, but it's organized political violence with clear sides, clear objectives, and clear outcomes. It's recognizable as war, even if it doesn't match the cinematic version. When we're evaluating what the tablet describes, this is the range we're working in, not whether a formal declaration was issued, but whether the text describes something with the structural features of coordinated group violence, territorial stakes, organized factions, and a resolution that one side won and the other didn't. That brings us to the question of how we evaluate parallels between traditions, because this is where intellectual honesty becomes non-negotiable. When you hear that two ancient cultures preserved what looks like the same memory, there are exactly three explanations available, and only three. The first is independent convergence. Both cultures arrived at similar stories because similar things actually happened, or because human minds tend to generate similar narrative structures when processing similar experiences. Wars happen everywhere. Memories of wars get shaped into stories everywhere. Some overlap is expected and means nothing. The second explanation is diffusion, meaning the story traveled. One culture encountered the other directly, or through intermediaries, and the tradition spread the way goods spread along trade routes. This happens constantly in human cultural history, and accounts for a huge number of apparent coincidences between distant traditions. The third explanation is a shared, older source. Both cultures independently inherited a tradition that was already old when they received it, something preserved from a common ancestor culture or transmitted through an unrecorded chain of contact so ancient that the traces have been erased. Each of these explanations has different implications and requires different kinds of evidence to evaluate. Independent convergence is the default assumption, and rightly so. The burden of proof sits with anyone arguing otherwise. Diffusion requires evidence of actual contact between the cultures, ideally, dated contact that precedes the recording of the stories. A shared older source is the most extraordinary claim and requires the most rigorous evidence, because you're essentially arguing for a chain of transmission so long that none of its links are directly visible. The criteria for moving past independent convergence are specific. The parallels have to be detailed enough that random convergence can't easily explain them. Not just two cultures remembering a war, but two cultures remembering a war with the same coalition structure, the same geographical context, the same sequence of events, in ways that myths don't normally overlap unless they're connected. You need to establish the dates of both traditions carefully enough to know whether direct, the scup contact was possible at the relevant time. And you need to see what the physical record says, because if the ground shows no trace of the kind of conflict the stories describe, the stories lose credibility, regardless of how well they match each other. If the ground does show that trace, the weight shifts. That's the analytical framework this entire investigation runs on. Not enthusiasm for mystery, not a desire to find a connection, but a genuine attempt to apply these criteria carefully and follow wherever the evidence actually leads. There will be moments where the answer is, we don't know. There will be places where scholars have made confident claims that the evidence doesn't fully support. We're going to flag those honestly, because the interesting truth is always more durable than the satisfying shortcut. With that framework in place, it's time to look at the object itself. The tablet, what it looks like, where it came from, who wrote it, and what it actually says. The tablet in question is not impressive at first glance. It's not huge. It's not made of gold. It doesn't show a glorious king trampling his enemies with a lion on a leash. It's a chunk of clay about the size of a hand, broken on at least two sides, its surface crowded with tiny wedge-shaped marks. If you saw it in a drawer with 100 other pieces like it, you might not give it a second look. Look closer, and the details start to matter. The clay is fine, carefully levigated, with very few inclusions. That usually means an urban production center with standardized methods, not a village improvising whatever soil was nearby. The color tells you about the firing. It's not sun-dried and crumbly. It's been thoroughly baked, intentionally, or in a fire that reached high temperatures. This is one reason it survived when almost everything else from its world did not. Papyrus burns, leather rots, clay once fired becomes stubborn. Across that hardened surface runs a script that, to the untrained eye, looks like a random pattern of dents. To a specialist, it's immediately recognizable, cuneiform, not pictographs, not protoating, but a mature system of wedges, pressed in, with a stylus cut from reed. The shapes and the way they're organized tell you even more. These are not the earliest clumsy experiments in turning spoken language into marks. The ductus, the stroke order, the way the wedges are formed, is regular. Signs are composed confidently. Whoever wrote this had been trained, but they weren't writing Sumerian, the earliest known language of cuneiform. The sign choices, the grammar embedded in the sequences, point instead to a later user of this writing technology, an Akkadian dialect. The language of empires that rose after Sumer, but still inherited its script, pinning down the exact dialect, is part of the scholarly tug-of-war over this tablet. Is it Old Akkadian? Is it later nudging into what we'd call Old Babylonian? Subtle shifts in verb forms and case endings matter because they push the composition date of the text up or down by centuries. Physically, what survives is maddeningly incomplete. The upper left corner is gone. A diagonal fracture has taken out part of the middle. The reverse is better preserved than the obverse, which is both a blessing and a curse, because narrative tablets usually start on the front and conclude on the back here. Large chunks of the opening are missing. We don't have the incipit, the formal beginning line that often states the title and purpose. We drop into the story midstream, like overhearing a conversation that's already underway. Names appear without introduction. Factions are mentioned as if we already know who they are. Locations are referred to obliquely. Then, just when the plot seems to reach a climax, another break swallows the line that might have spelled out the outcome in terms that even a modern reader could scarcely misinterpret. So, how do we know where this tablet came from? This is where provenance starts to matter, and where the story steps out of the dirt and into the modern world. The best-case scenario for any artifact is this. It's excavated by a professional team, recorded in situ, mapped, photographed, catalogued, and then published so other scholars can critique or confirm the find. In that case, we know the layer it came from, the building it sat in, the other objects around it. We can cross-check the date of the tablet with the pottery in the same level, the architecture, the associated ceilings. For this tablet, we have something less than that. It did come from a known site, a major mound, in a region that was once crowded with early city-states. We have excavation seasons documented there, in the early to mid-20th century, when thousands of tablets were recovered from palace archives and temple storerooms. Some of those tablets were accessioned directly into national museums. Others, especially broken or unimportant pieces, were sold off under legal but now deeply regretted partage and export policies, or entered the antiquities market through less controlled channels. The tablet we're talking about appears in the record, not in the original dig notebooks, but in a museum acquisition ledger decades later. The entry notes are purchased from a dealer, lists the site name he gave, and nothing about inventory numbers from the original excavation. The dealer, in turn, claimed it came from a particular archive room, a claim that is plausible given the tablet script style and clay fabric, but impossible to verify independently. Now, this is why some scholars are cautious. Provenance is not just academic fussiness. Where an object was found, and in what context, heavily constrains what you can responsibly say about it. A tablet that can be securely tied to a royal archive carries different weight than one whose journey from ground to display case passed through a private collection with spotty paperwork. Even so, the tablet fits a pattern. Texts with similar hand, similar content, and even repeated formula are known from that site's main tablet hoards. Those are unquestionably from an official archive, somewhere between palace and temple, in Tehe. Honoras, they include economic records, omen texts, letters, and a small but important group of literary or semi-literary compositions, stories about gods and kings that blur the line between report and performance. Our tablet seems to belong to that last group, and that's the next critical question. What kind of tablet is this? Ancient, ununiform tablets slop broadly into a few categories. Administrative tablets are the paperwork of ancient bureaucracy, rations, land allotments, tax lists, deliveries of barley and beer. Omen tablets collect observations and predictions. If the liver of the sacrificed sheep looks like this, the king's campaign will fail. Letters are literally letters, messages from one named person to another, often including details of real events. Then there are literary texts, myths, hymns, epics, laments. Finally, you get royal inscriptions, highly curated, often monumental texts that boast about building projects or campaigns. Our tablet doesn't look like a rational list. It doesn't have the layout or formula of a letter. It doesn't match standard Omen series formats. It reads in the surviving lines like a narrative. There are named leaders, described mustering of forces, speeches before action, references to divine favor or anger, and a sequence of engagements that build toward a decisive clash. At points it slips into elevated language, the kind of stylized phrasing you see in texts that were meant to be recited, not just read silently by Clark. So, is it an epic, a royal inscription disguised as one, a historical chronicle that has been shaped into something more performative? This is the main controversy. Some scholars argue it's essentially propaganda, a later king commissioning a retrospective story that casts his dynasty origin in the glow of a heroic victory over shadowy earlier enemies. On this reading, the war before history is a mythicized foundation event, no more historically reliable than Romulus and Rehais. Others contend that the text preserves real memories of conflicts between early riverine, cities and upland coalitions, fossilized oral traditions that were written down long after the fact, but still anchored in something that actually happened. This disagreement is not just about one tablet, it's about method. How do you tell whether an ancient text is mythic, historical, or something in between? There are several criteria scholars use. First, internal markers. Does the text give specific dates, reign lengths, or synchronisms with other known events? Myths often exist in a kind of timeless once upon a time. Chronicles and annals rarely do. Our tablet has a few time phrases, but nothing as concrete as in the year X of King Y. Second, naming practices. Purely mythic texts tend to feature obviously symbolic or theophoric names. Man of God, he whom the storm god loves, sometimes with no genealogy. More historical documents usually pile on patronymics, clan affiliations, and officials' titles. Here we get a mixture. Some names that could be real, some that look suspiciously formulaic, and at least one figure whose name seems more like a title than a personal identifier. Third, geographical precision. A story anchored in real geography will often mention minor rivers, obscure towns, specific routes. Mythic narratives often compress space, moving characters effortlessly between major symbolic locations. Our tablet describes a campaign along a corridor that can be roughly mapped onto a real landscape down to a contested pass and a river crossing. But it also exaggerates distances and compresses sequences in ways that feel more like storytelling than reporting. Fourth, cross-textual comparison. If an event is mentioned, however briefly, in multiple independent texts, especially of different genres, that strengthens the case for some historical core. The war on our tablet has a possible echo in one other fragmentary text, and maybe in a later, King lists cryptic remark, but nothing conclusive. Enough to tease, not enough to settle. Finally, there's the question of purpose. Why would someone commission or copy this text? Administrative records exist to manage resources. Omen tablets exist to guide decisions. Myths exist to explain the world to legitimate cults. Royal inscriptions often aim to justify power or intimidate rivals. Our tablet seems preoccupied with one thing above all, demonstrating that a particular coalition of land cities under a particular leader, blessed by a particular god, once faced a formidable, almost primordial enemy, and won. Is that myth? Is that history? Or is it a cultural memory whose edges have been sanded smooth by retelling, whose core may be factual, even as the surface is shaped for an audience. The only honest answer at this stage is that we're dealing with something in between. A narrative that wears mythic clothing, speaks the language of royal ideology, and yet insists on the stubborn particularity of places, alliances, and battle sequences in a way that feels very much like someone somewhere was trying to remember. To push beyond that, we need to know exactly when this text was written, how its language dates it, and whether the story it tells can be aligned with anything in the archaeological record. That means turning from the clay itself to the clocks we use to measure it. How we date a text, and how we date the war it claims to describe. When people hear that a tablet records a war, they often imagine we can just look at it, check the year stamped on the bottom, like an expiration date, and call it a day. But there are actually two different clocks running here, and they don't always agree. One is the date of the clay object in front of us, when this particular tablet was shaped, written on, and fired. The other is the age of the story it preserves, when the narrative itself crystallized into more or less the form we read. In the best case, those two moments are close. A scribe writes down a fresh event, sticks it in an archive, and we dig it up. But in literate civilizations that love to copy and recopy texts, the gap can be centuries, sometimes more than a millennium. So when you ask, how old is this war? The annoying scholarly answer is always, well, do you mean the tablet or the tradition? Let's start with the thing we can actually touch, the tablet. The first line of attack is paleography, the study of handwriting in a script like cuneiform. This isn't about whether someone has neat penmanship, it's about the exact shape, angle, and combination of wedges used to form each sign and how those shapes change over time. In the earliest days of ununiform, signs are big, clumsy, almost pictographic. Over centuries, they get stylized, rotated, split into multiple forms, recombined. By the time our tablet was written, the script had already gone through several of these revolutions. Specialists can lay our texts side by side with dated royal inscriptions, school tablets, and administrative records, and say, the way this scribe draws the Anon sign, the way he squeezes 3 little wedges into the lower corner of Dingar, the way his horizontal strokes taper, these are characteristic of a particular era. It's a bit like looking at old printed books. You can tell a 15th century annabulum from a 19th century novel by the font alone. Here, the font is baked into clay. On that basis, most paleographers would place this tablet within a certain slice of the 3rd or early 2nd millennium B.C., with some arguing for an earlier, more old Akkadian-looking hand, others for a slightly later transitional style. But handwriting is only half the story. The language itself is another clock. Languages drift, verb endings erode, new particles appear, old case endings get repurposed. The Akkadian on our tablet doesn't sound like the Akkadian of Sargon's time, and it doesn't sound like the Akkadian of Hammurabi's either. It sits somewhere in between, with grammar that feels old-fashioned in some spots and surprisingly modern in others. For example, particular ways of building relative clauses, preferred word orders, and even the choice between near-synonymous verbs can carry chronological weight. Certain spellings of common words come into fashion and then fall out again, like orthographic hairstyles. When you stack these features up and compare them to securely dated corpora, royal inscriptions, legal codes, date formulas in administrative tablets, you get a linguistic bracket. Whoever composed or last thoroughly edited this text was probably writing in this general period that gives us a rough date for the form of the text on the tablet. But it still doesn't tell us whether we're reading a first-edition thriller or a carefully copied classic. Then there are scribal conventions. Uniform writing isn't just free-form creativity. It's taught in schools using standardized exercises. Students copy model contracts, lists of signs, proverbs, and crucially, bits of famous texts. These schools have recognizable layouts, siphons, and mistakes. Sometimes they even say outright, copy of an old tablet. Our war tablet doesn't look like a beginner's exercise. The lines are crowded, but confident. The scribe uses advanced conventions, determinatives to mark gods and professions, section breaks signaled by spacing, even occasional rubric-like phrases that may cue performance. That suggests we're not dealing with some kid's homework. We're looking at a manuscript produced within a professional scribal environment that already had an idea of how such narrative should look on clay. But to move beyond handwriting and grammar, we need the ground. If a tablet comes from a controlled excavation, archaeologists can date the layer it was found in. Stratigraphy is essentially Earth's filing system. Newer stuff is on top, older stuff is deeper, unless later building activity has scrambled things. Pottery styles change over time. Building techniques shift. Radio-Arban dates cluster. When a tablet is found on the floor of a room that collapsed in a known destruction layer, burnt beams, smashed jars, charcoal that can be dated, you can say with some confidence, this tablet was in use when this building went down. For many ununiform texts, that's exactly how we do it. We say this level is late, early dynastic, or old Babylonian, based on the ceramics, the brick stamps, the associated artifacts. The tablets from that level are at latest that age. They might be older copies that were still lying around, but they can't be younger than the destruction that buried them. Our tablet frustratingly has a fuzzier archaeological context because of its modern collection history. The site name and general area are plausible. The specific room and level are not recorded in a way we can now verify. So we can't point to a neat stratigraphic diagram and say level 4 sealed by the Great Fire of year X. We can only compare the clay fabric, the firing, and the general script style with tablets from better attested layers at the same mound and from neighboring sites. That gives us a ballpark, not a street address. What about science, with capital S? Can we zap the tablet and get a date? There are techniques like thermoluminescence dating that can estimate when a ceramic object was last fired. In simple terms, mineral grains in the clay accumulate trapped electrons over time from environmental radiation. Heating them to high temperatures releases the stored energy as light, which can be measured. The amount of light correlates very roughly with how long it's been since the clay was baked. In theory, thermoluminescence could give us an absolute date for the last firing of the tablet. In practice, there are problems. The method has margin of error windows big enough that for something like early 2nd millennium versus late 3rd millennium, the answer may straddle both. It requires sampling, which is destructive. Tiny bits of the tablet have to be drilled or chipped off. Museums and antiquities authorities are understandably reluctant to let you damage unique, inscribed artifacts for a date that may not be decisive. And the technique works best on objects that haven't been reheated after burial, which is not always guaranteed in multi-phase sites. So for many tablets, including this one, thermoluminescence remains a theoretical option, rather than a routinely applied tool. The dating still leans heavily on scripts, languages, and context comparisons, not laboratory readouts. All of this gives us a working window for the tablet and for the version of the text written on it. But remember the other clock, the age of the story. In the ancient Near East, texts lived long lives. A popular composition could be copied and recopied in scribal schools for centuries. Lines would be adjusted, spellings updated, gods swapped out as dynasties changed. Sometimes the core narrative is older than any surviving tablet that carries it, like a song you'd learn from your grandparents that predates the recording technology you use to capture it. Scholars call this process textual transmission. You can see it when you compare multiple manuscripts of the same work. Some are clearly school copies, with only the opening lines or with mistakes corrected by a teacher. Others are deluxe versions, maybe archived in temples. Over time, a text might move from being a local tale to part of a recognized canon that every serious scribe was supposed to know. Our war narrative shows traces that it wasn't an improvisation. Formulaic lines repeat certain epithets, and turns of phrase match expressions known from other texts. There are rhythmic clusters that feel like they were meant to be recited, perhaps chanted, which is characteristic of material that has circulated orally and then been fixed in writing. All of that hints at a tradition behind the tablet, not just a single authorial moment. So when we say this tablet might have been written in, say, period X, we're only saying by that time, this version of the story existed in this language in this scribal milieu. The war it describes could be roughly contemporary with that period. It could also be a memory of events a few generations earlier, preserved and polished. Or it could be a literary reworking of something already old, reframed for a new political context. Dating the text and dating the war are related but not identical tasks. The first uses wedges and grammar as clocks. The second has to bring in archaeology, comparative traditions, and a lot of cautious inference. To see how far we can push that inference, we need to go back to the lines themselves, to the way this tablet tells its story of mobilization, campaigns, and catastrophe. Only then can we start to ask what kind of war is actually hiding inside this clay. If you strip away all the dates and paleography, what we're left with is a story. So, let's follow the story the way a contemporary listener might have heard it, line by line, as a war slowly comes into focus. The opening is deceptively calm. The tablet doesn't start with armies already clashing. It starts with a city, whose name was great among the lands under a king favored by a particular god. The formula is stock, but the details matter. The divine patron named here is not a generic lord of heaven, but a specific city god, whose cult center we know from other texts. The king's epithet links him to a named dynasty that appears in contemporary year names. Already the tablet is anchoring its narrative in a recognizable map of power. Then the tension creeps in. There's a line about boundaries being pushed like a measuring line and fields of another city being counted as his own. This is how cuneiform texts often talk about aggression without using a modern word like invasion. To extend the border to set up boundary stones in foreign fields is code for expansion, by force. The verbs are bureaucratic, but the implications are military. After this comes the first unmistakable war marker, a call to arms. The Akkadian has a verb usually translated as to raise the troops or to mobilize the warriors. It's not metaphorical. This is the technical language of mustering. He raised the troops of his city and the auxiliaries of the surrounding towns. Our tablet says he filled the roads with footmen and chariots. Footmen and chariots. That pairing immediately puts us in a particular military horizon. Not the earliest city conflict, but a world where elite wheeled war vehicles are symbolic capital as much as practical assets. We can trace the movement of this army almost like pins on a map. The scribe lists a sequence of toponyms, some familiar, others probably small towns that have never been securely located. Each is introduced with the same martial formula. He approached X. He set his camp against it. He encircled it like a net. That verb to encircle is one of the clearest siege markers. The same root appears in unmistakable siege contexts in royal inscriptions. Kings surround rebellious cities until hunger and thirst seize them. Our tablet doubles down on the siege imagery. The attacking king blocked their wells. He cut down their date palms. He closed the gates of water. These are not literary flourishes pulled out of thin air. This is the standard Near Eastern playbook for forcing a surrender without charging the walls. You target food, water, and shade. Weapons vocabulary clinches it. The text mentions bows and slings on the outer lines, and axes and daggers at the gate. There's a disputed sign cluster that some read as battering ram, others as a kind of pole arm. Either way, it's a term that almost never appears outside military narratives. Another line speaks of shields like stars over the plain. That simile shows up in later epics, but here it's hooked to very concrete nouns for shield types we know from lexical lists. As the story moves from campaign to catastrophe, the language shifts from technical to apocalyptic. We start to get the devastation motifs that scribes deploy when they want you to feel the scale of destruction. Smoke covered the city like a garment. Its blood flowed like water in the steppe. Mother did not recognize child in the street. These formulae are almost clichés, but their presence is precisely what marks this as a war text in a Mesopotamian idiom. When a city is sacked, scribes reach for the same toolkit of phrases over and over again. And yet, for all this specificity, the tablet is KY, in places where we might want it to speak plainly. There's a notoriously ambiguous line near the turning point. It contains a verb that can mean he abandoned the city or he evacuated the inhabitants, depending on how you divide the signs and which vowel you assume. In one reading, the king deserts his capital in cowardice, leaving it to its fate. In another, he organizes an orderly withdrawal to save his people before the final assault. The difference between those two readings completely flips the moral framing of the king's character. Another crux is a phrase that might refer to foreign troops from the upper land, or auxiliary spirits from the high heaven. Both are grammatically possible. If it's foreign troops, we're looking at a coalition war. The attacking kingdom has allies from the north, maybe a mountain confederation. We know from other texts. If it's heavenly spirits, the narrative is claiming direct divine intervention on the battlefield. One version is geopolitics, the other is theology. Even the central place name is not as straightforward as we'd like. The city under siege is spelled with a sequence of signs that can be read logographically as a known city in the alluvial plain, or syllabically as a name that would point us further upstream. The presence of that specific city god and certain local river names push most scholars toward the first identification, but a minority argues for the second. That debate shifts the war from one side of the region to the other. Then there are the divine patrons. On one side, the king is beloved of his city god and supported by a major storm deity. On the other, the opposing coalition invokes a goddess of warfare and kingship, who in later periods becomes central to empire ideology. The tablet even has a compact divine council scene, where the gods debate whether the city's sins justify what's about to happen. That scene uses a handful of rare epithets that tie it to a particular theological school, probably centered in one temple complex we can identify archaeologically. Again, the war is being situated inside a known religious geography. But notice what the tablet does not do. It never tells us why, in human terms, the war began. There is no explicit mention of unpaid tribute, trade embargoes, boundary disputes beyond the vague. He extended his border. No list of broken treaties, no quoted insults exchanged between royal couriers. The blame is framed almost entirely as moral and religious. They did not fear their god. They perverted justice. They neglected the rights. In other words, the cause of war is presented as sin, not strategy. It also never gives us numbers, no troop counts, no casualty to no durations beyond formulaic time spans, like for 7 days and 7 nights, which probably means for a long time, not literally a week. For reconstructing events, those omissions are frustrating. For understanding how the text wants to be read, they're revealing. The focus is not on logistics, but on cosmic legitimacy. We also don't get the other side's voice. The besieged king never speaks in direct speech. His envoys don't negotiate. The narrative is strictly from the victors, or at least the aggressors, point of view, even when it depicts disaster. That one-sidedness is not an accident. War narratives in this tradition are crafted to justify, not to balance. Even the ending is oddly silent. The last surviving lines speak of the city made a ruin mound, and its name erased from the tablets of the land. There may have been a concluding section where the king boasts of resettling captives or dedicating spoils to his god, but the tablet breaks off. We don't hear about reconstruction or aftermath. The story freezes at the moment of maximum destruction, as if that is the true climax. Not who ruled next, but the spectacle of divine judgment completed. All of these choices, the technical siege verbs, the devastation motifs, the named gods and dynasties, the strategic silences around motive and outcome, are part of how the tablet writes war. It's not a neutral chronicle. It's a patterned way of talking about violence that would have been instantly legible to a contemporary audience. To see what kind of world could produce and understand such a narrative, we have to step away from the clay and into the landscape it presupposes. A crowded plain of rival cities, canals and caravan routes, gods with competing jurisdictions, and kings who knew that their real battles were fought as much in the realm of meaning as with spears and slings. To imagine the world behind this tablet, you have to picture a landscape where war is not an exception, but one of the basic ways politics happens. We're not in the era of scattered villages anymore. We're in the age when people have started stacking themselves into cities, not modern megacities, dense nodes of 10, 20, maybe 30,000 people at most, ringed by smaller satellite towns and farmsteads. Each one is a small universe, walls, gates, a temple complex rising over mud-brick roofs, grain silos, workshops, a palace or governor's residence. And beyond the walls, a web of fields, orchards, canals, and country shrines. That's the first key. Cities don't float. They sit in irrigation systems. Most of the candidates for our tablet setting lie in river plains, where rainfall alone is not enough. If you want predictable crops, you have to tame water. That means cutting canals, maintaining levees, dredging silt, repairing breaches after every flood. You can't do that as a handful of households. You need coordination, labor mobilization, long-term planning. In other words, you need politics. Early kingship in this world likely grows out of that problem. Someone, or more accurately, some office has to say, this year we widen that canal, not that one. Someone has to decide who gets water on which day. If you control the gates that let river water into the fields, you control food. And if you control food, eventually, you control soldiers. Our tablet's war sits inside this ecology of power. Think about that line we heard earlier. He pushed the boundary like a measuring line on a baked flat alluvial plain. A boundary isn't just an abstract line on a map. It's the difference between fields that get water and fields that don't. Move that line a few hundred meters, and suddenly a village that used to irrigate from its own channel now depends on a canal whose headworks lie in someone else's territory. Overnight, their harvest and therefore their taxes and offerings shift from one city god to another. That is a recipe for conflict layer. On top of this, the rhythms of the rivers themselves. These systems are not stable. Floods miss some years. Other years they overshoot, smashing levees, drowning fields, filling canals with silt. There are multi-dead drought cycles, episodes of salinization when over-irrigated fields turn white and bitter and stop producing. Archaeology shows abandoned farmsteads, shifted canal lines, sudden changes in crop regimes. People are scrambling, relocating, trying to keep ahead of environmental change. They don't fully understand. In that context, he cut down their date palms isn't just a mean-spirited detail. Date palms are long investments. You plant and nurture them for years before they pay off. To burn an orchard is to destroy decades of labor and condemn a family line to hunger. War was in this world, are at bottom about who gets predictable calories and who gets left out when the river misbehaves. But cities don't only live off their hinterlands. By the time a scribe is writing in the register we see on this tablet, there are trade routes knit across the region like cords. From the north come timber and stone from the highlands, things the river plain lacks. From the east, metals, copper, tin, later bronze. From the south, or from distant coasts via middlemen, come seashells, exotic woods, lapis lazuli-colored stones. Outward go grain, wool, textiles, dried fish, oil. Caravans and riverboats move along predictable corridors that skirt deserts and follow water. Each city-state tries to clip a portion of this traffic. Control a ford, a canal junction, a harbor, and you can tax everything that passes. Build a garrison town at a bottleneck, and you can shut off a rival's access to timber or metals without firing a single arrow. When our text lists place names step by step, camp here, encircle there, it may not just be narrating conquest for glory's sake. It may be mapping a chain of strategic points that secure a trade artery, or open a corridor to the sea, or cut off a mountain route that feeds a competitor. We don't have a parallel commercial treaty that says he raised troops because the merchants of X refused to pay tolls. What we have is a pious story about a king punishing sin and injustice. But in a landscape like this, moral language and material interests usually travel together. Then there's the temple. In these cities, the temple isn't just a religious building. It's a landowner, an employer, a bank, a storehouse, a law court, and sometimes a workshop. Fields are belonging to the god, herds are of the goddess. But in practice that means they're controlled by a priestly bureaucracy working with or under the palace. Kingship ideology weaves through this institutional tangle. A king is not merely the toughest warrior or richest man. He is chosen by the god, shepherd of the people, builder of the temple, provider of abundance. There are regular rituals where he enacts his dependence on the deity, bringing spoils, renewing his mandate, sometimes even ritually grasping the hand of the god's statue to symbolically receive authority. So when our tablet has a divine council scene debating the city's sins, it's not random mythic color, it's how this society thinks politics works. If a city is prospering, it's because its god is pleased. If canals silt up, if locusts hit the barley, if the king suffers military defeat, then it must be because someone has broken the right order of things, neglected offerings, oppressed widows, tampered with boundary stones. To sack a city and then write that its people did not fear their god is to say, the disaster proves we were right. The god's verdict is visible in the ruins. The king's army, in that way of thinking, is not just an army. It's the execution squad of the divine court. This is why war texts lean so hard on formulas like by the command of this or that deity, or with the great weapons of some warrior god. It's why enemy kings are described as usurpers, oath-breakers, sinners, even when we strongly suspect their crimes were things like backing the wrong side in a succession struggle or trying to slip out of a vassalage treaty. Now, how much of this can we say with confidence? And how much are we inferring? We're on fairly solid ground when we talk about early urbanism, irrigation, and trade. Archaeology gives us city plans, canal traces, storage facilities, imported materials, inscriptions from other sites, list rations, work teams, land grants to temples, even canal cleaning crews. They show kings boasting of digging waterways and restoring canals neglected since ancient days. All of that matches the kind of world our tablet assumes. Cities clustered along rivers, locked into systems that live or die with water management. We're also on secure footing about basic political structure. Dozens of texts from roughly comparable periods show city-states jostling, forging alliances, paying and refusing tribute, invoking gods to bless their campaigns. They call enemy cities rebellious or sinful, almost as a reflex. In that sense, the ideological frame of our war story is typical, not unique. Where we move into more speculative territory is when we try to pin down specific triggers. Was there a particular drought decade that set tempers on edge? Did a rival city divert a canal? Were merchants squeezed by new tolls on a trade route, leading one palace to arm up against another? The tablet doesn't say. It chooses to tell this as a morality play, not as a resource dispute. So when we imagine squinting fields, half-empty granaries, bales of wool waiting in warehouses until the road is safe again, that's an educated reconstruction, not a quotation from the clay. Likewise, when we talk about temples acting as banks or kingship rituals tying military success to divine favor, we're stitching together patterns from a wider corpus of texts, hymns, legal documents, foundation deposits, later royal inscriptions that may or may not map neatly onto the period of our tablet. The general picture is widely accepted. The exact details for this specific war are not. Still, that composite picture matters because it tells us what kind of story a scribe thought would make sense. If you live in a world where cities rise and fall with the river level, where trade routes can enrich or starve you, where temples manage grain and gods judge kings, then a narrative of siege, famine, and divine verdict is not just propaganda. It's a way of making sense of terrifying structural forces. The tablet, in other words, is not just about one king and one campaign. It's about a whole system under strain, trying to tell itself that the hammers falling from the sky are really the measured blows of justice. Whether that's history, myth, or something in between, that's the question we have to take up next. When you finally step back from the drama of the text, This is the uncomfortable question that hits you. What exactly are we reading? Is this a report of something that happened? Or is it a sermon dressed up as a war story? Or is it a marketing brochure for a king who wants his name to outlast his bones? For ancient texts like this, those aren't three separate boxes. Most of the time, they're the same box. In our world, we're used to distinct genres. We have history books, political speeches, religious sermons, epic fantasy, and we feel cheated if they blend too much. In the world of this tablet, those boundaries don't exist. The same scribe who copies temple hymns is the one who writes down treaties, royal boasts, and legal contracts. The same king who digs the canal for the god, leads the army, and presides over festivals. A war is at once a political decision, an economic gamble, a religious event, and a personal glory project. The story you tell about it is supposed to cover all of that at once. So texts from this world are almost always triple-layered. First layer, theology. The gods decide, the gods authorize, the gods punish. That's the level at which our tablet's divine council scene operates. The war is not just one king getting mad at another, it's the gods hashing out cosmic justice. Second layer, royal ideology. The king has to appear as the ideal ruler, brave, wise, pious, effective. He doesn't just win, he wins the right way. He consults omens. He honors treaties until the other side breaks them. He humbly credits his victories to the god, while somehow still being the hero of every sentence. Third layer events. Something actually happened. Soldiers marched. People starved. Walls fell. Cities burned. If none of that had occurred, there would be nothing for the theology and ideology to grab onto. The tablet we're dealing with is working hard on all three layers at once. One of the first clues that we're not just reading neutral reportage is the pattern of the war story itself. Once you've read a few dozen ancient Near Eastern campaign narratives, you start hearing the same chords. The enemy is never just a rival state. They are rebellious, sinful, arrogant, who did not fear their God. Their king is not simply ambitious, he's a usurper, an oathbreaker, a liar. The text doesn't assign that maybe he also had irrigation to maintain and trade routes to protect. He is a problem in the cosmic order that needs fixing. That's enemy demonization. It's very old, and it hasn't gone away. Then there's divine intervention. Nobody just wins because their logistics were better and their archers were on point. They win by the command of the city god, with the mighty weapon of the storm god, after a prophetic dream announces the outcome in advance. The king might get wounded, the siege might drag on for years, but the narrative will smooth those bumps into a single inevitable arc. The god decided, the god delivered. And finally, there's the total victory trope. Enemy cities are utterly destroyed. Their people are cut down with the sword. Not one escaped. Their gods are shattered. Their fields burned with fire. Their name wiped out forever. Then you flip a few hundred years forward in the archaeological record, and there they are again. The city is rebuilt. The cult continues. People are living on the same mound. The wiped-out forever state is paying taxes to someone else and writing its own boasts. So when we see our tablet talk about the annihilation of the enemy, we have to remember this is a literary habit, not necessarily a census. If that's the case, how do historians even start to separate the history from the myth and the propaganda? They don't have a magic algorithm, but they do use a few rough criteria. One is consistency across independent sources. If one king claims to have annihilated city X, that's propaganda. If 2 or 3 unrelated inscriptions from different places, maybe in different languages, all refer to the same campaign, the same siege, the same captured ruler, suddenly, we're on firmer ground. The details may still be spun, but there's clearly a real event underneath. Another is the presence of mundane, boring details. The more a text bothers with things like rations, troop numbers, length of marches, specific place names, lists of damage assessed, or treaty clauses, the more likely it is that at least some of that material is anchored in administrative reality. A story that says, the king shining like the sun, smoked the wicked land, and returned in triumph, is pure ideology. A story that says, in his 3rd year, he mustered X troops from these towns, camped at these specific places, laid siege for N days, took Y captives, and assigned them to canal maintenance. Gives you something to test. Our tablet is interesting here because it mixes the two. It has cosmic language, divine counsels, moral judgments, but it also seems to trace a campaign, route to name specific settlements, to mention things like famine conditions and the cutting of orchards. Those are not the motifs you'd invent purely for mythic grandeur. They feel like the kind of abrasive detail that comes from lived experience. Then there's external corroboration. Archaeology can show destruction layers in cities that the text names dated layers of ash, smashed walls, arrowheads embedded in floors, sudden breaks in occupation. If those layers line up, even loosely with the supposed date of the campaign, that's a tick in the something happened here column. In some famous cases we get lucky. A king's boast about sacking a city matches a burned level in that city's expiration, and a lamentation text from the same region mourns the same event from the other side. Suddenly, what looked like pure royal bragging turns into one angle on a widely remembered disaster. For our tablet, we're not quite that lucky, but the logic is the same. Scholars line up the toponyms with known sites, check their occupational history, look for signs of upheaval, and then argue sometimes viciously about how close the fit really is. Put all of that together, and one plausible scenario emerges. At some point in this early urban world, there was a real conflict. Maybe it started as a dispute over a boundary canal. Maybe a vassal city tried to peel away from its overlord. Maybe a drought decade pushed a king to seize someone else's verde's surplus before his own people starved. Armies fought. A city or a string of towns really did fall. People fled, were killed, or were dragged off into forced labor. That raw experience, smoke on the horizon, refugees at the gate, the taste of grain from fields that used to belong to someone else, lodged in memory. Over time, that memory was reworked. For the victors, it became a morality tale about the gods' justice, the king's courage, the wickedness of the enemy. For the losers, it may have turned into a lamentation, a story about divine abandonment, a template for every later disaster. Later scribes trained in a school tradition took that event memory and cast it into familiar patterns. Divine counsel at the start, total destruction at the end. Standard phrases of blame and praise in between. They weren't faking it exactly. They were making it meaningful. That's one way to read our tablet, as a remembered war lifted from the level of muddy boots and smoking thatch into the realm of cosmic order and divine verdict. But not everyone agrees. Some scholars lean hard toward the history side. For them, the place names, the sequence of campaigns, the environmental details add up to an eyewitness account, polished for an elite audience. The divine scenes are just the expected pious packaging around a basically factual core. Others emphasize the mice side. They see the narrative as a retelling of a stock pattern, a hubristic city, a god's anger, a punishing war, a purged and reordered world. The names and geography might be real, but what matters is the pattern, not the particulars. The war stands in for every crisis this society faces, when canals fail and fields go white. And then there's the propaganda reading. In that view, the text is primarily about one thing, making the current regime look inevitable and legitimate. The story chooses its villains and heroes, with one eye on contemporary politics. It might exaggerate the enemy's guilt, inflate casualty numbers, erase compromises and setbacks. It doesn't lie so much as it edits ruthlessly for effect. Which of these is correct? The awkward answer is all of them, to different degrees. And we don't know exactly where the dials are set. The safest place to stand is to say this. The tablet is not a transparent window onto the past, but neither is it pure invention. It is a memory machine. It takes something that happened in a particular landscape, between particular cities under particular environmental pressures, and recodes it as a story about how the universe is supposed to work. And the strangest part is that, apparently not the only civilization that did this with this particular war. Because somewhere else, carved in a different script, wrapped in a different theology, another people remembered what looks like the same disaster. That's where we go next. When scholars first realized this, it felt like a glitch in the matrix. You have one civilization with its own pantheon, its own script, its own royal house, telling a story about a devastating war, and then hundreds of miles away, sometimes centuries later, in manuscript form, another civilization is telling what looks disturbingly like the same story. Different god names, different king names, different moral spin, but the bones are there. So, who are these other storytellers? In most reconstructions, our tablet comes out of the early Mesopotamian world, city-states on the rivers, kings who are basically chief priests with better armor, gods who live in temples that look suspiciously like palaces. The other memory lives in a tradition that at first glance seems far removed, a later highland kingdom, a culture that defines itself in part by not being the river people in a language that won't even exist yet when our tablet is wet clay. Their version of the war isn't on a tablet at all. It survives as an epic, not a royal inscription, not an administrative report, but a long narrative that was performed, recited, sung, and only much later pinned down in writing. On the surface, it's about their own ancestral king. Let's call him the founder, because that's what he becomes. The man who unites the tribes, defeats the arrogant land empire, and establishes a covenant with his god that supposedly explains why his people are still around when bigger kingdoms have turned to dust. In the epic, the first protagonist is not actually the founder himself, but the god who chooses him. The story opens in heaven, with a complaint very similar to the divine council scene on our tablet. The gods look down and see a city that has grown proud, that has forgotten justice, that drinks the blood of the poor. The phrasing is different, the theology sharper. This tradition likes its moral lines drawn in black and white, but the logic is the same. A human political crisis is framed as a cosmic lawsuit. Then the god calls the founder. He's not yet a king, just a local war leader, or even a shepherd chieftain. He's told to rise up against the great empire along the river, the one that oppresses the peoples and builds its walls to the sky. The hubris imagery again is familiar. High walls, high towers, high hearts that need to be humbled. The cause of conflict in their telling is not a broken treaty or a border canal, it's covenant violation. The river empire trampled the oath it swore by the god, shed innocent blood, and trusted in its chariots and horses, rather than in the divine will. Those are theological versions of very practical grievances: heavy tribute, forced labor, military conscription, the usual package of empire. But in the epic, the reasons are moral, not geopolitical. The turning points of the story come in 3 beats. First, there is an omen scene. The founder hesitates. Going to war against the empire is suicide, and asks for a sign. He receives not one but several: a dream, a prophetic oracle, a miraculous event in nature. Each one is narrated in detail, with formulaic language that almost certainly comes from ritual, practice. These are the same kind of divination procedures our tablet's king would have used, just filtered through a different religious vocabulary. Second, there is a battle that seems lost. The founder marches out, wins some initial skirmishes, then gets hammered. The epic is surprisingly honest here. His army is routed, his allies flee. The empire captures key cities. There is a siege in which famine is described with gut-level horror, parents boiling leather, dogs fighting over corpses in the street. If you've read the tablet's description of orchards being cut, fields burned, water sources blocked, this all rings uncomfortably similar. Different imagery, same experience. War has induced famine. Third, there is a moment of reversal around a capital city. In the epic, the founder's god turns the tide by striking the empire's king with madness, or blindness, or hubris. We have different manuscript variants here. Either way, the great king makes a fatally bad decision. He breaks off a siege, pursues a decoy force, leaves his supply lines exposed. The founder ambushes him, captures or kills him, depending on the version, and the empire crumbles. The aftermath in this tradition is not just enemy wiped out forever. It's reordering. The founder doesn't sack every city. He imposes a tribute system and reappoints local rulers as vassals. He destroys idols in some sanctuaries, but spares others. The epic lingers over the moment when he stands in the defeated capital's main temple, dismantles the city god's statue, and declares his own god-king over all the earth. You can hear the echo of our tablet's language about conquering gods and humiliated cults. That same symbolic gesture, marching a defeated deity into exile, shows up in both traditions. Now, what medium are we dealing with? Our tablet is a single object, probably copied in a scribal school, maybe with a colophon giving the name of a king or an archive. Highland's story is the opposite. It lives as performance for generations before it congeals into text. We get it much later in manuscripts that are already centuries removed from the events they claim to describe. Some scholars think the core of the epic might preserve memories from the late 2nd millennium B.C.E. The manuscripts we can actually date are 1,000 years younger. That time gap matters. By the time scribes are writing it down, they're not eyewitnesses. They're inheritors of a long oral tradition that has been reshaped with each retelling. You can see the layers. There are archaic turns of phrase that don't match the later language of the manuscripts. Hints that bards are preserving fossilized lines they no longer fully understand. There are obvious editorial seams where one episode contradicts another because a later redactor stitched two rival versions together. There are anachronisms, mention of technologies, buildings, and political realities that simply didn't exist at the putative time of the founder. The tradition also has its own theological editing history. Early on, the epic may have been a tribal war song about throwing off land dominance. Later, priests reframe it as a covenant story. The founder wins because he is uniquely obedient to the god's law. Later still, scribes under new regimes insert hints that their current dynasty is the true heir of the founder's promise. So when we try to use this epic as a source for an ancient war, we're not just dealing with distance in time, we're dealing with ideological refits, theological upgrades, narrative remixes. Then there's the dating problem. Unlike our tablet, which can be dated roughly by script style, archaeological context, and references to known kings, the epic's events float. Its own internal chronology is fuzzy. It uses formulas like in those days and after many years, more than precise regal years. The founder's reign is given symbolic lengths, 40 years, or multiples of 7, that scream literary more than archival. Scholars have spent careers trying to anchor it. Some line up the described famine with known regional droughts. Others match the empire's fall with specific destruction layers in land cities. Others argue it's a composite, blending memories of several conflicts into one hyper-war. All of that makes it tempting to throw up our hands and say, these are just different stories. But when people claim that the epic remembers the same war as our tablet, what do they actually mean? They don't mean every detail matches. They mean the skeleton of the narrative is eerily parallel. In both traditions, you have a river-based imperial power presented as wealthy, oppressive, and arrogant. A smaller highland, or fringe polity, led by a divinely chosen ruler who resists that power. A period of escalating tension over tribute, treaties, or perceived impiety. A god council scene where the fate of the offending city or empire is decided. A campaign that moves along a recognizable route, hitting some of the same intermediate towns. A catastrophic siege in which famine, not just battle, is the main killer. A decisive reversal involving the enemy king's misjudgment or divine abandonment. A ritual humiliation of the defeated city's god, followed by a reordering of the political map. The same way could mean several overlapping things. It could be structural. Both stories follow the same arc, from oath-breaking to divine lawsuit, to war, to judgment, to new order. It could be motif-based, shared images like cutting orchards, damming canals, parading captive gods, the proud walls that reach the heavens. It could be geographic place names that look like they've pointing to the same cluster of cities, just filtered through different languages and later scribal spellings. In more ambitious reconstructions, It even extends to names. Some see the epic's empire king's name as a distorted memory of the king named on our tablet. Consonants drift, vowels change, titles get mistaken for personal names. Over centuries of oral transmission, King X of City Y turns into Zarak of the Northland, but the core echo remains. Chronology is the shakiest match. The tablet belongs to a specific horizon in the archaeological record. The epic's supposed events are smeared across a wide span of centuries. When people say same war here, they are not claiming we can align year 3 of King so-and-so with year 15 of the founder. They're saying somewhere in this tangle of legend is a bright shard of the same disaster. That's the claim. 2 civilizations, 2 media, one fixed in clay, one fluid in song, seem to remember a war that at some level looks shared. How we test that claim is where things get interesting. Because once you put these narratives side by side, you have to ask, are we looking at a common historical core, or are we just seeing what happens when human beings confronted with drought, empire, and defeat reach for the same story template? So, let's actually put them next to each other. Take the tablet text and the Highland epic and strip them down to bullet points. What survives the pruning? On the tablet side, the sequence runs something like city grows powerful, rich, and forgets right order. Complaints rise, some human, some divine. A council of gods debates the city's fate. 1 or 2 argue for mercy. The presiding god opts for war. A rival king is chosen, armed with signs and oracles, and ordered to cut down its strength. Campaign follows a route down the river system, subduing allied towns. Main target city is besieged. Fields are burned, orchards felled, canals blocked. Famine and thirst do most of the killing. Enemy king makes a catastrophic mistake, either rejecting a last-chance treaty or sallying out at the wrong moment. City falls. The god's statue is seized. The temple is desecrated. Captives and tribute are taken away. Text ends with the victor credited as restorer of justice, and the patron god proclaimed supreme. Now the epic in its leanest form, empire on the river, is exalted, trusting in its walls and chariots, and crushing the weak. The god of the highlands convenes a heavenly court, indicts the empire for oath-breaking and bloodshed, and announces judgment. A local leader, the founder, is summoned, given omens and prophetic backing, and told to rise against the great king. Campaign descends toward the lands, picking off garrisons and vassal towns. Along the way, a major siege unfolds, with vivid depictions of famine and social collapse inside the walls. The imperial king, struck with madness or overconfidence, abandons good strategy, walks into an ambush, and is removed from the board. The capital is entered, its main god publicly humiliated, its political order rearranged under new overlordship. The story closes with the founder's god hailed as king of heaven and earth. The defeat of the empire framed as moral vindication. Lay those skeletons side by side, and the resemblances look uncomfortable. Same basic cast. Arrogant river empire. Smaller upland challenger. Presiding deity orchestrating events. A chosen human agent. Same core beats. Moral or ritual offense. Divine lawsuit. Appointment of a rival campaign through intermediate towns. Starvation siege. Enemy king's misstep. Divine and political reordering. Even some of the signature details line up. Both talk about cutting down fruit trees and vines as an act of war, not just as incidental damage. Both make a point of blocking water canals on the tablet springs and cisterns in the epic as a deliberate tactic. Both linger on parading the defeated god, or dismantling the idol as the climax, as if moving a statue somehow moves the universe. Those are the strongest parallels. They're why anyone even dares to say same war with a straight face. But once you stop at the skeleton and start putting flesh back on, the differences show just as sharply. The theology is almost inversed. On the tablet, the gods are a committee. They argue they can be persuaded. They sometimes contradict each other. Justice is more like keeping the cosmic filing cabinet in order than punishing specific moral crimes. The city is doomed because it disrupted the sacred equilibrium, botched rituals, offended higher-ranking gods, broke treaties sworn by divine names. In the epic, the god is almost alone. He doesn't negotiate his decision so much as announce it. The city falls because it did evil. It shed innocent blood, abused the poor, trusted in military hardware rather than covenant loyalty. Cosmic order here is ethical order. You sense later theologians tightening the screws, turning political grievance into a sermon. The geography is also different in feel, even when the outlines look similar. The tablet thinks in river lines and canal junctions. Distances are marked in days of boat travel and irrigation branches. The enemy city is at the bend of the great river, its strength, its control of water. The epic's mental map is ridges and passes, valleys where ambushes happen, fortified hill towns going down to the plain and coming up to the stronghold. If the same places are in view, they've been mentally rotated 90 degrees, seen from different home ground. Outcomes diverge too. On the tablet, the end is annihilation rhetoric. The enemy is made like a ruin mound, its people scattered to the winds, its name erased from the tablets of the gods. We know from archaeology that cities usually bounce back from these kinds of defeats, but the inscription wants the war to sound terminal. In the epic, the enemy is broken but not erased. The founder reorganizes, appoints governors, sets tribute, leaves some sanctuaries functioning. The point is not extermination but subordination. The empire is humiliated so that the highland god can sit on top of the pyramid, and the moral message, the so what, pulls in different directions. The tablet, the king who listens to omens, honors the gods and obeys the divine decision will be favored. See our king. It's a royal press release dressed as cosmic history. The epic. The empire fell because it oppressed and trusted in itself. The founder prevailed because he trusted the god and kept the covenant. Therefore, our present community is the rightful heir. It's identity politics, wrapped in theology, aimed downwards at a people as much as upwards at the throne. Once you see these divergences, a problem appears. If you go hunting for parallels, you will find them almost anywhere. Sieges usually involve famine. Victors usually boast about their god being stronger than the loser's god. Upland minorities almost always tell stories about how the land empire was arrogant and got what was coming. Those aren't smoking guns. They're basic settings of ancient Near Eastern life. This is where cherry-picking creeps in. If you only collect the matching pieces, the famine, the hubris, the paraded statues, you can convince yourself of a near identity between texts that are actually doing very different things. If you also list the unmatched details, the exact diplomatic pretext, the specific cities named, the order of campaigns, the post-war settlement, the neat picture blurs fast. Comparative myth and comparative historiography are attempts to discipline that impulse. Instead of this reminds me of that, they ask more structured questions. How many points of similarity are there? And how rare are they in the wider cultural pool? Is God council deciding a city's fate a local specialty? Or does it show up from Egypt to Anatolia? Does the precise sequence of events match? Or are we just sliding beads around on a vague story frame? Scholars build motif indexes, structural charts, even statistical models of narrative features. They look for shared weirdness. Not just two stories about a siege, but two stories that both say the attacking army cut down the sacred date palms outside the north gate, and then dammed the city's canal on day 7 of the siege. The stranger, and more specific the overlap, the harder it is to wave away as coincidence. They also watch out for dependence. Do later texts quote or allude to earlier ones? Do they share exact phrases, formulaic lines, favorite curses that can signal direct borrowing rather than parallel invention? So, what would count as truly compelling similarity between our war tablet and the Highland epic? Not that both have a proud city punished by the gods. That's expected. Not that both have famine in a siege. Also expected. You'd want multiple independent low-probability hits. A tight sequence of distinctive events that match in order, not just in content. Overlaps in obscure place names that can reasonably be mapped to the same locations. Echoes of unusual ritual actions, say a particular curse pulled from a temple, or a very specific way of humiliating the defeated god. Maybe even hints that one tradition knew the other's version. A line that sounds like a deliberate inversion or correction of the tablet's propaganda. Below that threshold, the safer conclusion is that both stories are dipping into a common toolkit of ancient Near Eastern war narrative, each in its own language and for its own purposes. Above that threshold, you start to suspect a shared historical core, however distorted. Right now, the debate lives in that gray middle. Enough similarity to be intriguing, enough difference to keep easy answers out of reach. Which raises the next question. If there is a shared core, how did it get from clay tablet country up into Highland song? Did the story travel along trade routes and refugee paths? Or did two cultures living through the same kind of disaster just gravitate toward the same narrative shape? If the stories are related, they didn't teleport. They had to move inside people. So, what were the actual highways for memories in this part of the world? Start with the obvious ones. Rivers. In the ancient Near East, rivers aren't just water. They're information networks. Boats carry grain, timber, copper, textiles, and gossip. Every bend in the river is a checkpoint. Customs officials, priests collecting temple dues, innkeepers, dock workers, every one of them hears travelers talk. Add in the caravan routes. Long lines of donkeys and camels inching from oasis to oasis, from the floodplains up into the highlands and back. They move obsidian, tin, luxury wool, exotic woods. But along with the goods come songs, curses, place names, legends about which city offended, which god, and got smashed for it last generation. Diplomatic roads overlay all of this. We have letters between kings, separated by hundreds of miles, complaining about gold, shipments, negotiating marriages, begging for physicians or divers, envoys, translators, scribes, bodyguards, whole micro-societies of professionals shuttled from court to court. They carry gifts. Yes, they also carry stories, because that's what people do when they'd go stuck together on the road for weeks. Imagine a scribe from tablet land traveling with a diplomatic mission up toward the hills. At night in some caravanserai, the locals ask what news there is from the great river kingdom. He answers the way scribes know best, by reciting a bit of royal inscription he'd copied 100 times. Our Lord, beloved of the storm god, who laid low the rebellious city at the bend of the great river. Half a century later, somebody's grandson in that same highland village still remembers snatches of that story. The names have blurred. The theology has been swapped out for his own god, but the backbone of the tale is still there. Arrogant city, divine lawsuit, chosen instrument, disastrous siege. This is one of the cleanest models historians have for how narratives diffuse. Not as whole pristine texts moving from archive to archive, but as chunks and motifs leaking out through human contact. And that's before we even bring in the specialists whose job description was basically move texts between cultures. Ancient scribal schools are crucial here. In the big cities, scribes learned to write in stages. First symbol signs, then common words, then model texts. Many of those model texts were royal inscriptions and famous epics. A student in one century copies out the story of a god-sanctioned war as handwriting practice. 200 years later, another student is still copying the same lines. Now half archaic, not fully understood, but charged with prestige. Now add bilingual scribes. We know these existed because we have their homework. Tablets with one side in the imperial language, the other in a local tongue. Word lists, sign lists, miniature dictionaries. These people straddled worlds. They translated treaties, interpreted omens, read out foreign letters. A bilingual scribe is a perfect vector for story movement. He hears an old court hymn about the king who cut off water to the rebel city and repackages that image when he composes or edits a hymn for his own local ruler. The bones of the earlier war tale get reincarnated under a new god's name. There's also prestige borrowing. If your neighbor empire has a famous epic about their warrior king chosen by the gods to overthrow chaos, it's very tempting for your own rulers to commission something similar. We see this all over the region. Later kings adopt the stock phrases and story shapes of older, more prestigious powers. They call themselves King of the Four Quarters, Shepherd of Peoples, Hammer of the Enemies, even when their actual territory is modest. They model their building inscriptions on much older ones, down to the sequence, list of titles, divine commission, description of conquest, moral spin. In that environment, borrowing the skeleton of a successful divine war story and refitting it to your own history is almost expected. It's how you say we belong in the same league as the ancients. Our God acts the way their God acted. Our war was that kind of war. But the flow of stories doesn't just follow golden diplomats. It also follows people whose movements barely show up in official records. Refugees, for instance. When a city falls, not everyone dies or gets deported. Some flee out the back gate, over the hills, into neighboring territories. They show up in mountain villages or marginal towns, with nothing but what they can carry and what they can remember. Refugee memory is sharp. The day they burned the orchards, the week the canal dried up, the king's last mad charge out of the gate. These aren't abstract motifs. They're the defining scenes of a life ripped in half. A highland community that takes in lowland refugees will hear those stories around hearths for years. As generations pass, the names of foreign gods are swapped for local ones. The politics get edited, the details warp. But those sharp bits, dry canal, felled trees, disgraced statue can lodge in the narrative DNA. Mercenaries are another carrier. We have records of hired troops crossing linguistic and cultural frontiers all the time. Archers from one country, fighting for a king 2 valleys over. Chariot crews from the plains stationed in hillside forts. War bands marry locals retire in foreign lands. Bring home songs of battles that happened far away. A mercenary who served in the land king's disastrous siege might return to his highland home with vivid tales of what he saw. Years later, a local poet grabs those scenes and plugs them into a story about how the highland, a god, brought that arrogant city down. Then there's intermarriage. Royal marriages are diplomatic, but even mundane marriages create dense networks. A trader from the river plain marries into a mountain village. His children grow up bilingual. They hear grandmother's river stories and grandfather's ridge stories. Their brains are natural remix engines. Every wedding that crosses a cultural boundary is potentially a little story bridge. Finally, we have to talk about the way later empires edit the past to serve the present. When a big power takes over a region that already has its own traditions, there's an incentive to harmonize origin stories. If the locals tell of a heroic founder who overthrew a wicked empire with the help of their god, the new overlord might decide that this founder was actually acting on behalf of the imperial high god all along, or that the wicked empire was really a rogue province of their own tradition. We can see this retrofitting in texts that explicitly claim what our ancestors dimly knew. We now reveal clearly. They rewrite older tales, smooth contradictions, align disparate gods, turn ambiguous heroes into proto-members of their own people. Once that process starts, it becomes harder to tell whether two similar stories share a genuinely ancient connection, or whether a later editor has forced them into parallel, for ideological reasons. So where does that leave us? On one side, we have dense networks of trade, migration, and diplomacy that absolutely can carry narrative motifs from tablet land to the highlands. We have scribal systems and bilingual mediators that specialize in translating and repackaging prestigious stories. We have the messy human traffic of refugees, mercenaries, and intermarriages, all of them carrying private memories of very public catastrophes. We have empires with both the motive and the means to rewrite and realign older traditions to bolster their own legitimacy. Put all that together, and diffusion, some degree of story travel, looks not only possible, but historically plausible. But plausible is not the same as proven. Similar stories can spread along these networks. They can also arise independently in societies facing similar enemies, similar landscapes, similar traumas. The existence of highways doesn't tell you for sure that this specific caravan went from this city to that village at this time. Diffusion is one live hypothesis. It explains a lot, and the ancient world gives it plenty of pathways. It's just not the only game in town, because there's another possibility that different cultures staring down the same kind of empire and the same kind of siege might spontaneously build their memories on the same underlying pattern. Even if no one ever sat down with a tablet and said, "Here, copy this." That's where we go next. Suppose no one copied anyone. No bilingual scribe, no refugee testimony, no caravan-side recitation of a famous royal inscription. Suppose each culture is looking at its own disaster in its own language with its own gods, and it still ends up telling recognizably the same kind of war. That's not magic. That's convergent storytelling. Biologists talk about convergence when dolphins and ichthyosaurs both evolve the same torpedo-shaped body, because water and speed demand it, even though they're separated by millions of years. Historians and psychologists can talk about something similar when very different. Societies under very similar pressures evolve the same narrative shapes. Think about what siege warfare feels like from the inside. You have a city that thinks of itself as the center of the world. It has walls, temples, archives, a hereditary elite that's sure the gods are basically on retainer. Outside those walls, a larger power appears. Not just a band of raiders, an empire with more men, more horses, better logistics, a track record of turning free cities into tax-paying provinces. If you're inside, the emotional experience of that clash has certain predictable beats. No matter what language you curse in first, there's the shock that it's happening at all. We, of all cities, cannot fall. We are chosen, special, protected. That's the arrogance before the storm. Then comes the tightening of the ring. Fields burned, orchards cut, canals sabotaged, the slow strangling of the food supply. The city realizes too late that the siege is not a bad dream. It's a new reality. As hunger bites and disease spreads, the mood turns inward. Suspicions bloom. Who negotiated with the enemy? Who opened a poster gate at night to see what they wanted? Who misread the omen that said not to rebel this year? Someone will be blamed. Maybe they really did send word to the enemy. Maybe they merely counseled surrender when everyone else shouted defiance. In any case, when the city falls, the simplest way to explain the disaster is we were betrayed. Add to that the endgame, the last sortie, the king or general who rides out with everything left. To the survivors, that looks and feels like a heroic last stand, whether or not it was militarily smart, is the moment when all the fear and rage get focused into one desperate act. And over all of this hovers the question, where were the gods? Empires don't just defeat cities, they humiliate their gods, toppling statues, looting temples, carrying cultic objects off in triumph. For a people whose whole worldview says, our God dwells here and protects us, that's not just political loss, it's cosmic disconfirmation. To make sense of that, you have two basic options. Either your God wasn't as strong as you thought, or your God chose to stand aside, or even help the enemy because you deserved it. Ancient theologians almost always choose the second option. It keeps the God powerful and puts the blame on human behavior. We were corrupt. We broke the covenant. We oppressed the poor. We worshipped the wrong gods. So, our own God raised up the empire to punish us. Pack all of that together, and you have a template that practically writes itself. A siege brought on by internal arrogance. A betrayal or internal failure that makes the fall inevitable. A heroic last stand that gives the story a spine. Divine favor operating paradoxically on the side of the enemy as judgment, but also promising a reset afterward, a future restoration or new beginning once the debt is paid. When you put the River Kingdom tablet and the Highland tradition side by side, both of them hit these notes. Both remember a city that thought it was untouchable. Both remember a drawn-out conflict that ends in a catastrophic breach. Both feature a moment of treachery or internal collapse that becomes the moral pivot of the tale. Both give us a figure, king, prophet, war leader, whose defiance or obedience in the final hours becomes the model for what true loyalty looks like. Both interpret the whole thing not as random geopolitical bad luck, but as a kind of lawsuit in the divine court. The empire doesn't simply win, it is permitted to win, as the instrument of a higher plan. And after the wreckage, both traditions hint that this is not the end of the people, only the end of that particular arrangement with their god. You could draw lines of influence to explain this, or you can recognize that these are just the narrative forms that human minds grab when they'd grap, when they're trying to process an overpowering defeat. Because our brains do something peculiar with trauma on the ground. A siege is a multi-year mess, shifting alliances, fluctuating grain prices, factional politics inside and outside the walls, random outbreaks of disease, 1,000 contingent decisions by minor players. But memory hates that. Human memory, especially collective memory, compresses time and simplifies causality. We flatten months into the summer the water stopped. We compress a decade of bad governance into the reign of the wicked king. We boil down 1,000 interacting causes into a single satisfying hook. We fell because we betrayed the covenant. We fell because the general lost his nerve. We fell because the goddess turned her face away. Historians tracing administrative records see complexity. Storytellers retelling around fires or on temple steps generate clarity. If they agree on anything, it's that the chaos needs to be shaped into a pattern that feels just, or at least intelligible. And our pattern-hungry brains are excellent at obliging. Cognitive scientists will tell you humans are inveterate pattern matchers. We're built to see structure, to extract templates to say, ah, this is that again. Once a community has one powerful narrative of siege and punishment, later events will get interpreted through that lens. This empire is like that empire. This drought is like that drought. Our king is like that king. The more you retell the archetypal story, the more any new crisis snaps into the same grooves. Multiply that across cultures, and you get something else. Even when there is no shared text, outside observers can notice uncannily similar story skeletons. We recognize the arrogant city-punished plot in Mesopotamian laments, in biblical prophecy, in Greek tales of hubris, in later chronicles about Rome or Constantinople. Not because they all copied a single text, but because elites under siege, priests explaining, catastrophe, and survivors trying to live with what happened, all reach for the same, limited, toolkit of narrative moves. So when we look at our two war stories, weighing diffusion against convergence, we have to ask some very specific questions. Are the similarities just those broad motifs? Siege, betrayal, heroic last stand, divine favor turned to judgment, promise of a reset that practically every traumatized city produces. If so, convergence looks strong. Two communities facing a roughly similar kind of empire war could easily independently distill their experience into that shape, or do we see tighter overlaps? Very particular imagery, like cutting off irrigation canals instead of just starving the city. A specific sequence of events, envoy rejected, omens misread, gates open from within, temple plundered, that goes beyond what you'd expect from generic catastrophe. The more specific the parallels, the more weight you can put on diffusion, even if the highway between them is partly lost. In our case, it's a mix. Some of what these texts share is universal trauma grammar. Any culture that watches its capital strangled, and its gods, house desecrated, is going to talk about arrogance, betrayal, last stands, and divine anger. But some details do seem oddly aligned, more so than random convergence would easily explain. The way water control becomes a theological weapon. The framing of the war as not just punishment of the city, but as a reset for the surrounding world order. Those edges are where the debate lives. Convergent storytelling is not a cop-out. It's a reminder that human minds dropped into similar historical furnaces tend to temper into similar shapes. Diffusion says this story walked. Convergence says this story grew here because this is what grows in this soil under this climate. To decide which one dominates, we can't just stare at texts. We have to ask the ground itself what happened. So what would the ground look like if this war, or something very much like it, actually happened? If you strip away the gods, the prophecies, the heroic speeches, a siege and sack on the scale, these traditions, remember, leaves a surprisingly consistent archaeological fingerprint. Start with fire. Big cities in the ancient world were not just stone. They were mud brick, timber, plaster, woven mats, beams soaked in pitch. When one of those cities dies violently, it tends to die hot. Archaeologists call it a burn layer, a band of soil, sometimes only a few centimeters thick, running across the entire site. Reddened earth, ash, charcoal, melted mud brick, roof tiles fired harder than any normal kiln. If you're very lucky, you get things like warped bronze weapons, clay tablets, baked in the very fire that destroyed the archive. A routine house fire doesn't do that to an entire tell. A slow decline doesn't leave that kind of sharp boundary. An empire army moving systematically block by block with torches and battering rams does. Then there are fortifications. A city that expects nothing worse than occasional raiding invests in walls that look impressive but are basically glorified property lines. A city that has already watched one empire reduce its neighbors to rubble builds differently. You see thicker ramparts, glacis slopes of piled earth to deflect siege engines, hastily added towers that cut across earlier streets, gate complexes rebuilt in a hurry with blocked upside doors, and narrowed entrances that turn easy access into killing funnels. Sometimes you can see the panic in the masonry. Carefully laid stonework gives way in upper courses to irregular boulders jammed together, because they needed height now, not beauty in 10 years. If a text remembers we strengthened our walls and trusted in them, the ground either shows a phase of frantic buttressing in exactly that period, or it doesn't. Next, bodies, not the orderly, carefully dug graves in a cemetery outside the walls. But what happens when thousands of people die in a short span, and nobody has the time or social capacity to mourn them properly? Mass graves, trenches filled in one episode, with dozens or hundreds of individuals, bodies tossed in with minimal orientation, sometimes showing permortem trauma, cut marks on vertebrae, crushed skulls, embedded arrowheads, age and sex distributions skewed toward prime-age adults, the people you would expect to be fighting or trying to flee with children in their arms. In extreme cases, you get something even starker. Bodies left in the destruction debris itself, pinned under collapsed walls or burned in place. A woman with a child's bones beside her under a fallen roof. A soldier whose sword is still in his hand. Weaponry tells a story too. When warfare escalates, you often see a shift in the toolkit, a sudden spike in specialized arrowheads, new forms of spear points, optimized for piercing armor, sling bullets carefully shaped and standardized, the introduction of siege gear, stone projectiles for catapults, iron fittings that only make sense as parts of rams or towers. If an empire famous for a particular weapon system is supposed to have shown up, you look for that signature. Did those arrowheads, that style of chariot fitting, that distinctive armor plate suddenly appear in the destruction layer? And then there's everything that doesn't burn or bleed. The quiet signatures of a system coming apart. War, on the scale these stories describe, doesn't just hit one city. It ripples through a whole landscape. You can trace that in settlement patterns. Before the crisis, you see a hierarchy. Big urban center ringed by medium-sized towns, surrounded by villages and farmsteads. After a major sack, sometimes that whole pattern collapses. The capital is abandoned or reoccupied on a smaller scale. The ring of towns thins out. Populations retreat to hilltops, caves, marginal land. New fortified hamlets appear, where there used to be open farm country. Trade takes a hit too. Pottery is a favorite proxy. In a stable system, the same fine wares show up across a region. A river city-style bowl in highland villages, imported jars from the coast, stacked in inland storerooms. When empires fight, and caravan routes become killing zones that flow stutters or breaks, you might see a layer where imported ceramics drop off dramatically. Exotic stones, shells, pigments disappear from the archaeological record for a generation or two. Workshops that once turned out standardized goods shut down or switch to cruder, purely local products. On the bureaucratic side, archives vanish for a while, clay tablets stop accumulating, seals with the old king's name get reused as convenient lumps of stone, or are found smashed in the ash in their place. Much later, you might get a new style of seal, a new titular, a new language creeping into the inscriptions from the ground's point of view. That's what a sudden political change looks like. An abrupt end to one administrative handwriting, a gap, then another. So what happens when we actually go looking around, the time our tablet claims this war happened? We do see candidate horizons in the River Kingdom zone. There is indeed a destruction layer at the capital Tel, dated roughly to the same broad period as the tablet's inscription. The city shows heavy burning, collapsed monumental buildings, a subsequent reoccupation phase, where the new structures are smaller, poorer, almost apologetic. The fortification line is rebuilt, but never quite to its previous scale. In the highlands, there is a cluster of sites that seem to wink out around the same horizon. Fortified hilltop settlements with rich imported goods in earlier levels suddenly end in burn, layers, or abandonment. For a generation or two, the countryside looks emptied. When people come back, they build differently, more scattered, more defensively, with less evidence of centralized authority. Some scholars point to these as the material shadow of the remembered war. They argue that what the texts stylize as one climactic campaign was on the ground a messy, regional conflict, maybe stretching over decades, that nonetheless left a coherent swath of destruction. Others are more cautious, and this is where the dating headaches begin. Ancient cities don't die just once. They're reoccupied, rebuilt, tunneled into by later occupants. A destruction layer in one part of a site can be cut through by a well from a century later, or smeared by borrowing animals, or mixed by farmers digging for mudbrick. You rarely get the clean textbook stratigraphy of peaceful city layer. Then a razor-sharp ash band, then new city on top. More often, it's a jumble. Pits intruding into older floors, trash dumps spanning multiple centuries, a hearth dug into what used to be a palace wall. Even if you have a nice fat burn layer, pinning an exact date on it is hard. Radio Arbon gives ranges, not calendar days. The pottery styles that help narrow those ranges change gradually, not overnight. And slow violence. A long period of raids, famine, political stress can produce a pattern in the ground that looks, in some ways, like the aftermath of a single dramatic sack. A city might lose half its population over 20 years of crisis, leaving houses to decay and be scavenged piece by piece, leaving gaps in the neighborhood fabric. When a later fire finally sweeps through the under-occupied ruins, the archaeological signal compresses all that drawn-out suffering into one neat ashband. Storytellers will remember the year the city burned. The ground is muttering. It was worse and slower than that. Add to this the problem of matching texts to layers. The tablet may remember the great breaking of X, but the archaeologist in the trench has to ask, which breaking? The one dated by a scarab in this layer, the one suggested by imported pottery in that layer, or some event that left almost no trace where we've happened to dig. Some proposed alignments look tempting. A particular destruction horizon at a secondary city lines up nicely with the sequence of events in the River Kingdom text. First, the outlying fortress falls, then the capital. Further up slope in what might be the highland sphere, we see a slump in trade goods and a shift to emergency architecture at roughly the same time. Other links are speculative at best. The most dramatic highland destruction we found so far may be a century too late for a strict reading of the chronology. The layer that should be the tablet's war at the river capital shows disruption, but not the overwhelming raze to the ground that the rhetoric suggests. And there are glaring absences. We do not yet have a clearly identified mass grave that screams, "This is the sack the poets keep talking about." We don't have a single unambiguous siege ramp or line of circumvallation dated tightly to the right decade. We don't have burned archive tablets that specifically name the enemy king whose boasts are preserved on our stone. If any of those turned up, if, say, a destruction layer at the river capital yielded an archive, with a last-minute treaty draft mentioning the Highland Coalition by name, that would change the debate overnight. It would take the war out of the realm of plausible convergence plus foggy memory, and anchor at least part of it to a specific datable episode. Likewise, if extended excavation at the Highland candidate sites showed a smooth, non-violent transition instead of catastrophe, no burn, no massacre, just gradual architectural change that would weaken the case that their tradition is remembering the same kind of event as the tablet. For now, the ground gives us a fractured mirror. We see that this region did, in fact, go through a period of punctuated violence and restructuring that roughly matches the epoch both stories point to. We see cities burned, fortifications rushed, trade arteries kinked, political scripts rewritten. But we do not yet see a single smoking crater we can label with confidence. This is that war. Which means the argument doesn't stop at the edge of the trench. It spills back into the seminar room, where scholars fight over what counts as enough, and how much absence is meaningful. And that in turn shapes what they argue about next. If you drop in on this debate at a conference, you might think everyone is talking about a different tablet. They're not. They're staring at the same carved stone, the same short text, the same handful of key lines. What they disagree about is almost everything around it. Start with the basic question. What is this thing? One camp treats it as a royal inscription in the classic Near Eastern sense, a victory stela, a king boasting about his triumph over a dangerous coalition, packaging a messy campaign as a single glorious war with the gods as his witnesses. For them, the River King on the tablet is a historical monarch. The enemy confederation is a real Highland polity. The battle is an event, even if the details are hazy. You can argue about which king, which polity, which battle, but you don't argue about the genre. It's history, dressed up for court. Another camp looks at the same text and says, no, this is not straightforward historiography. This is closer to what we'd call a foundation myth, or a charter myth. On that reading, the war is a stylized story that explains why the River Kingdom is now dominant, or why a temple holds certain privileges, or why the current dynasty claims special favor. The enemy might be a composite. The chronology might be collapsed. Names are more about symbolism and cosmic order than about who actually swung swords at whom. And then there are scholars who push even farther. For them, the tablet is almost liturgy, a ritual recitation to be read at festivals, invoking a primordial victory of order over chaos, dressed up in just enough contemporary geography to feel local. Same stone, very different mental file folders. These genre arguments matter because they quietly set the default for every other question. If you assume the tablet is basically a war report, then any mismatch with archaeology is a problem to be solved. If you assume it's mythic, the same mismatch becomes expected, even reassuring. The next fault line runs right through the translation itself. The text is short, the script is early, some signs are ambiguous, and scholars can't even agree where to put the commas. There's a key line where the king says something like, I broke the strength of X in the passes of Y. Except the word we're glossing as passes could also be gates or throats, or even a technical term for a kind of defensive work. If it's mountain passes, the story wants a highland battlefield. If it's city gates, the decisive moment is an urban siege. If it's metaphorical throats, the line might be a poetic way of saying, I cut off their lifelines. Then there are the names. In our simplified version, we've been calling them the River Kingdom and the Highland Coalition, as if those were clear-cut geopolitical blocks. The tablet doesn't make it that easy. Some phrases that look like place names can also be read as titles or epithets. What one scholar translates as King of the Four Rivers, another takes as Lord of all frontiers, which doesn't have to refer to any particular stretch of water at all. The supposed name of the enemy might be a region or a clan or a term like uplanders, a label lumping together everyone in the hills beyond the tax collector's reach. The crucial phrase that some write as City of X might actually be Fortress of X, or House of X, or something more like Domain of X. Change city to house, and you may have shifted from a siege of a capital to the suppression of a rebellious noble family. The parallel tradition over in the Highlands has its own ambiguities. Their epic speaks of the burning of the great enclosure and the breaking of the steps, but what those actually are is an open question. Are those the formal names of real fortresses, generic phrases for any walled compound and any stepped terrace? Or are they ritual spaces, like temple courtyards or sacred stairways, that were later reimagined as urban strongholds? Some scholars argue that Great Enclosure is a dynastic title, not a building at all, more like the House of Windsor than a literal house. Line up all these uncertainties, and you can see why attempts to match the tablet and the oral epic, term for term, start to wobble. Layered on top of translation and genre is the perpetual ghost at the feast: provenance. Where exactly did this tablet come from? Who dug it up? When and under what circumstances? We have an excavation report, but it's from the early days of scientific archaeology, when documentation was optimistic. The tablet is said to have come from a secondary context, reused as fill in a later wall. The surrounding locust was disturbed. The notes are thin. There's no convenient photograph of it lying in situ with a labeled scale rod. That's enough to make some scholars uneasy. A minority has raised the specter of forgery. Ancient Near Eastern fakes exist. A clever artisan with access to old stone could in theory carve a text that pushes all the right buttons and sell it to credulous collectors or underfunded excavators. The counter-argument from specialists who'd handled the tablet is that it does not behave like a modern fake. The carving style matches other securely excavated pieces. The weathering patterns run into the incisions in ways that suggest real age. The language down to the boring function words fits what we expect from that stage of the script. The mistakes in the text are the kind ancient scribes actually make, not the ones modern forgers usually imagine. Stylistic analysis, microscopic examination of tool marks, even residue studies on the stone, all come back with the same verdict. If this is a forgery, it's an impossibly good one. So the mainstream view in the field is that the tablet is authentic, even if its precise original setting is a little blurry. Where does that leave consensus more broadly? Most specialists would probably sign off on a cautious middle position. They'd say yes, the tablet is a real product of a real ancient court. Yes, it is built around some memory of actual military conflict between lowland and highland powers. No, it is not a transparent day-by-day diary of that conflict. It is a heavily curated, ideologically loaded snapshot designed to say something about divine favor and royal identity as much as about troop movements. On the Highland side, most agree that the epic tradition is not free-floating fantasy. It remembers real landscapes, real political tensions, real fears of land armies coming up the roads. But it has been sung, reshaped, condensed, and morally edited over generations. It is a moral drama about betrayal and revenge, as much as a memory of fire and rubble. Minority theories cluster at the edges. Some argue the two traditions have nothing to do with each other at all. Similarities are just what you get when agrarian states and upland groups clash anywhere on Puck Earth. Lowlands talk about rebellious hill tribes. Highlands talk about faithless city kings. Everyone claims the gods were on their side. Others push a maximalist line. They insist specific rulers in the River Dynasty list can be matched to named heroes and villains in the Highland saga. That the convergence is too tight to be coincidence. That stripped of pious gloss, we are looking at a single datable war with a shockingly accurate double record. Why does any of this matter beyond the fun of arguing over every verb? Because, underneath the technical quarrels is a bigger question. How do early societies remember violence? If the tablet is close to reportage, then we have one of the earliest examples of a state trying to freeze a traumatic event in stone. This happened, we did it. The gods approved. That's the beginning of official war history, the ancestor of every carved victory list and engraved treaty to come. If it's closer to myth, we're seeing how communities turn messy, terrifying conflicts into stories that explain why the world is the way it is, why this city rules that valley, why this sanctuary received its offerings, why those people over the mountains are still spoken of as enemies, even when nobody remembers exactly what started it. The parallel Highland tradition matters for the same reason. It shows the other side of the coin, how those on the losing or peripheral end of state violence carry it forward. Maybe not as dates and treaties, but as songs about burned places, broken oaths, vanished houses, memories that don't care about exact chronology, but care very much about who suffered and who is still accountable. Put together, the arguments over script and genre and place names become more than academic, hair-splitting. They're our attempt to read in two very different voices, one of the earliest conversations humanity had with itself about organized destruction. Who gets to tell the story, what they choose to say, and what, despite all the carving and singing, still slips away. And that leads to the last piece of the puzzle, not just what is remembered, but why this particular memory survived when so many others didn't. Some conflicts vanish so completely that archaeologists have to infer them from scorch marks and broken bones. Others refuse to die. This one clearly didn't. A king in the lowlands carved his side of it in stone. Centuries, maybe a millennium later, people in the hills were still singing the counter-version. Why this war of all the thousands that must have burned through that borderland? One answer is that at some point it stopped being just a war and became an origin story. Wars that matter to memory are rarely the neat little "we raided." They raided skirmishes that make up everyday frontier life. The ones that stick are the ones that can be retold as turning points. This is when we became who we are. This is when the world started working the way it does now. For the River Kingdom, the tablet frames the conflict exactly like that. Chaos on the borders, enemies banding together, the center at risk. Then a ruler who steps in, defeats the coalition, dedicates the victory to the gods, and emerges as the proper guardian of order. That isn't just a win, that's a charter. From then on, every time someone asked, "Why does this dynasty rule this stretch of river?" or "Why does this temple get these taxes?" the answer could echo back to that story. Because long ago, when the highlands rose up, our king crushed the threat, and the gods signed off on the outcome. The Highland memory leans the same raw material in the opposite direction. Here, the war is not about the birth of rightful order. It's about betrayal, loss, displacement. A great enclosure burned, a lineage broken, a land cursed. People who had once been central cast themselves as survivors, exiles, keepers of a grievance. That explains why they live where they do, and why they distrust the plains. This is why we left. This is why we owe the city people nothing. Turn a war into an origin story, and you've done something powerful. You've wired it into identity, but identity alone doesn't keep a memory alive for 1,000 years. It also needs infrastructure. By the time the tablet was carved, the River Kingdom wasn't just a cluster of farms. It had institutions that specialized in remembering. Temples where priests recited stock phrases about divine victories. Courts where scribes copied model texts for training. New Year festivals, where the king reenacted symbolically or literally his defeat of chaos. A tablet like this doesn't float around as a one-off. It plugs into that whole ecosystem. Young scribes are made to copy it because it has the right royal formulas and verb forms. Priests mine its lines for liturgy. This is how you talk about the king subduing enemies. This is the order in which you name the gods. Judges and administrators learn its rhetoric of rebellion and punishment because it matches how the law code imagines disobedience. Every time it's copied, quoted, or alluded to, the story gets another life extension. Even if the exact hill fort that burned becomes a fuzzy memory, the narrative pattern remains carved into practice. Enemies gather. The king crushes them. The gods approve. The city's special status is reaffirmed. On the Highland side, the infrastructure looks different, but serves a similar function. Instead of temple schools, you have ritual specialists and lineages of singers. Instead of written curriculara, you have initiation cycles. Young people learn the long song, not because they're curious antiquarians, but because to be an adult in that community is to know who your enemies were, who failed you, and which oaths were broken. The epic gets tied to real calendars, sung at funerals, at planting time, at the ascent to summer pastures. Each performance adds a few tweaks for local politics, but the core arc, a proud house, a burning, a forced migration, stays fixed. All of this makes the story hard to forget, but something else helps it resurface when it might otherwise fade. New disasters, crises, are like highlighters for old memories. When a later river king faces another highland revolt, there's a ready-made frame to reach for. Advisors can say, "Remember the great victory of our ancestor in the passes of Y." Scribes can dust off the old phrases, adjust the names, and suddenly, the current campaign looks like a replay of the foundational one. The past becomes both prophecy and precedent. In the hills, the same thing happens in reverse. A new round of land pressure, a new round of burned fields, and the old epic starts to feel uncomfortably current. Singers emphasize the parts about treachery, exile, divine anger at rulers who overreach. The implication is clear. What happened then is happening again. These flashpoints are where copying and retelling surge. Texts get recopied because rulers want to associate themselves with famous victories. Songs get elaborated because communities want to show that their suffering is part of a long pattern, not an isolated misfortune. In both cases, selection pressure works in favor of the older narrative that best explains the present. Somewhere inside that feedback loop is probably where our double memory took shape. A real conflict between land and highland powers left scars, burned structures, lost lineages, disrupted trade. In the River Kingdom, that trauma was gradually compressed into a victory story that justified royal and temple privilege. In the Highlands, the same trauma was reframed as a righteous loss that explained displacement and ongoing hostility. Both versions got institutional backing, one through stone, schools, and ritual calendars, the other through lineages, performance, and sacred places. Then, as later generations faced new rounds of violence, those old narratives kept being pulled back into service, polished, and redeployed. Each reuse made them a little more stylized, a little more moralized, but also more deeply entrenched. That's one reason the story is at the heart of the book I've written about this whole puzzle about how early states and their neighbors remember violence, reshape it, and pass it on. A cautious synthesis might go something like this. We probably aren't dealing with pure coincidence. Two completely unrelated wars that just happen to line up in theme and structure. Nor are we likely staring at perfect mirror accounts of a single battle preserved with GPS precision across centuries. Instead, it seems plausible that there was a cluster of conflicts over a generation or two that redefined the relationship between one river kingdom and its upland neighbors. Those events were big enough, disruptive enough, and politically useful enough to be turned into charter stories on both sides. The tablet captures one official crystallization of that memory, already trimmed and shaped to fit royal ideology. The Highland epic preserves another, stretched and embroidered by oral tradition, but anchored to the same kind of crisis. What survived was not the day-by-day reality of the fighting, but the narrative tools people built out of it. Origin myths, moral lessons, and divine justice stories that kept being helpful long after the last spear was thrown. The fact that two different civilizations found those tools worth keeping and kept them long, enough for us to glimpse the overlap, is what makes this tablet more than just another broken stone. It makes it a rare window into how deep and how durable human memories of violence can be. So after all this, what are we actually allowed to say out loud without crossing the line from history into fan fiction? We can say with a straight face that the tablet is a royal inscription from a real kingdom, carved in a script and language we know well enough to teach to undergrads. Its core message is clear. There was a coalition of highland enemies. They advanced toward the river plain. The king claims to have crushed them with divine backing, and the text treats that outcome as a turning point. We can also say that the second tradition really exists as more than rumor. It's not one random folktale some ethnographer scribbled down in the 1920s and then lost. It's a cluster of related narratives recorded over decades from different singers and lineages that converge on a shared arc, an upland power, a devastating attack by lowlanders, a sacred place burned, survivors forced into new territory, and a sense that this was the moment we became who we are. We can say that the geographic and thematic overlaps between the two are at minimum eyebrow-raising. The same general frontier, the same basic pairing of river-centered state and upland polities, the same imagery of burning enclosures and broken oaths, the same conversion of war into an origin story. We can say that the time frames are at least compatible. The tablet belongs to a period when that frontier was active. The oral tradition based on linguistic layers and internal references plausibly reaches back, step by step, performer by performer, into the later phases of that same era. Those are the solid boards of this bridge, but large sections of it are still fog. One big uncertainty is the dating stack itself. Yes, we can date the clay and the archaeological layer where the tablet was found. We can bracket the script style and formula to a certain window, but we don't know when the story it tells first started circulating. There might be older versions we've never seen, or the inscription could be the first time someone decided to package routine frontier violence as a cosmic showdown. On the upland side, the chronological scaffolding is even wobblier. Oral formulaic analysis can tell us that some phrases are archaic, that certain place names preserve older phonology, that the poem has grown by accretion. It cannot hand us a neat label that says, composed in 1320 B.C.E., revised in 900. The deeper you try to peer, the blurrier it gets. Then there's translation. The royal text is short, dense, and written in a register that loves ambiguity. Does that verb mean annihilated or subdued? Is the phrase city of X a specific fortified town, or a whole tribal region? Is the line about burning their gate literal siege reportage, or a stock metaphor for humiliation? Tiny choices in how we render a word into modern language can tilt the way the story lines up with the Highland version. The oral tradition has its own traps. Collectors wrote what they heard through the filter of their own ears, accents, and expectations. Performers sometimes tailored episodes to current politics or to the audience in front of them. When a singer uses an old ritual term whose meaning has drifted, are we hearing genuine archaism or creative mishering already centuries deep? And then there's what's missing altogether. We do not yet have a smoking gun archaeological layer where a hill fort in exactly the right place shows a burn horizon that can be radiocarbon pinned to the same decade the tablet implies. We don't have a Highland inscription joyfully cursing the River King by name. We can map out clusters of destroyed sites, shifts in settlement patterns, changes in trade routes, but stitching those into a single narrative is more art than certainty. Because of all that, the big picture options remain open. One possibility is diffusion. A real war happens. The land state turns it into a victory inscription. News of that boasting leaks into the hills through captives, traders, defectors, and is digested into an upland counter-epic that preserves the same skeleton from a different angle. Another is convergence. The frontier between valley states and mountain peoples is a machine that produces similar conflicts over and over. Given enough time, both sides will tend to tell stories about burned enclosures, treachery, justified revenge, divine backing. The parallels might reflect the shared logic of that border more than a single specific campaign. And then there's the shared kernel option. At some point back in the before history period for this region, there's a cluster of brutal campaigns that really does reset the balance between lowland and highland societies. Both sides build origin stories out of those events. Over centuries, each tradition gets edited, spliced, updated with later crises, but they keep circling the same ancestral trauma. Right now, the evidence doesn't force us to pick just one of these. Different scholars weight them differently. New digs and new readings slide the dial a little, but no one gets a final referee whistle. So, I'm curious where you land if you've listened this far. Which interpretation feels most convincing to you? Diffusion from a written text into song, independent convergence on a shared frontier template, or some deep, older kernel that both civilizations have been orbiting for 1,000 years or more? Let me know in the comments what details tipped you one way or the other. Was it a particular phrase on the tablet, a scene in the Highland epic, the way the archaeology lined up or didn't? While you're there, or right after this video, please do take a second to like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help more people find this kind of long view history. Before you go, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and how far back you think human memory can really reach before it stops being history and becomes something far stranger. Thanks for joining me on this journey to the edge of myth, memory, and the historical record. I'll see you in the next one.